Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. Actually, editing Gog here, get to, this is a long video. Welcome back to Teaser Season for patch 0.3.0 and the Third Edict. Today, we're going to be talking about patch notes. Now, Grinding Gear Games dropped the patch notes a little while ago, but unfortunately, they are absolutely and utterly massive. My first thought was, why don't I do one massive video on it? Then I realized it's 17,000 words, just reading them aloud would be 2¼ hours on its own, and so I thought, I'm probably going to need to break this one up. Adding to this, YouTube has a couple of platform limitations, such as the limit to only have 100 timestamps that I add, that might actually come up if I was to try and do the entire thing, because I would like to provide people with the ability to jump around a little bit. Down at the bottom of the video, not actually down in the comments below, but in the video itself, you will see chapters. Chapters will allow you to navigate around. So for instance, you could skip the early parts that are a recap of what was discussed in yesterday's GGG live stream event, if you happen to watch that, because you probably already know it. What I'm going to do is cover the top matter on the patch notes, all the way up to but not including the section on player changes in this video. So this is part 1. Part 2 and probably part 3 as well will come out after that, and they'll deal with some of the other massive changes that are taking place in this expansion. The first thing I want to do is go through some information that might be a bit of a recap for those of you that watched the live stream announcement from Grinding Gear Games. So I'm not going to go into this in any big amount of detail, but they put out this awesome little infographic that just goes through the high-level features of the patch. This is something they definitely should do again. Now, new content-wise, we have Act 4, 16 new areas, 12 new bosses, 3 micro acts called Interludes, and this is how they're removing cruel difficulty. This is going to provide 19 new areas and 12 new bosses. These will stay in the game as map content in the future. A number of these might end up feeling like, imagine if you're a Path of Exile 1 player, you had a mini encounter against the Guardian of the Phoenix earlier in progression than you normally would, and the Guardian of the Phoenix wasn't level 83, but instead of that it was down at maybe level 62 or something like that. And that's the sort of thing I think they're going for here. More complicated bosses, things that will stay around in Endgame in the future, but for now, they're going to be used in this mini act system. So this is going to be a way that you're going to be able to build XP on your character and just pick up a few more items so that you're able to go from the end of Act 4 to being able to tackle the actual endgame proper. Then we have the new League content, The Rise of the Abyssal, which is going to include a new crafting system, which is very similar superficially to Path of Exile 1's Jun system, and also it's going to have 4 new bosses tied to it. After that, there's a substantial new rebalance. Grinding Gear Games' goal, I don't think they're going to hit this, but their goal here is to make it so that all of the classes and pretty much every skill in the game feels viable to use as a main skill, except maybe for a couple of things that are obviously support only. There's going to be 150 new notables on the classic passive tree, and there's going to be 12 new skill gems. 12 new skill gems, I think we got all of them, and we'll get to those in a sec when we get to the patch notes side of new features. Jumping over to the other major features, there's going to be the new support gem system. So something that I didn't really talk about all that much in my coverage yesterday is the multiple versions of the same support gem are going to exist now. What I mean by this is that you'll have a version 1, version 2, and a version 3. It seems like the goal we're going for is that version 2 is strictly better than version 1. So version 1 gives you the core functionality, but it's not very good. Version 2 then comes along and says, hey, I'm going to give you more of that same effect. And then version 3 takes a different take on it. One example that they gave us was faster casting support, which is going to be rank 1, I think it was 15% cast speed, rank 2, 20% cast speed, rank 3, 10% cast speed per different spell you have cast over the last 8 seconds. So this is something that's objectively worse if you're only using one spell, even than the rank 1 version, but if you can make it work, then it can end up being far better. Additionally, there is the change that's being made where you can use multiple copies of the same support gem. This is something I've talked about previously. I'm a little bit apprehensive about this. That's my fear there. A lot of the more interesting support gems will end up just being buried under the weight of being worse than the numerically strong support gems that do something very basic. I definitely hope to be proven wrong on that, but we'll find out more in the future. There are also 40 Lineage support gems. These are ones you can only use one copy of, and these are very much endgame rewards. They're going to come from bosses and things like that. Some of them are extremely strong. For instance, one of them is effectively a mini enhance, mini empower, and mini enlighten from Path of Exile 1. And probably the most explosive of the lot is the one that is Reikiata themed, which is going to cause supported skills to treat monster elemental resistances as inverted. So if you're going up against the Arbiter of Ash, who has resistances of 75 to each of the 3 elements, then this is going to turn those resistances from plus 75 into minus 75. Now, there's other things you could have done in order to get through the Arbiter's resistances, but this is going to be an explosively powerful one. It's going to be equivalent on the Arbiter of Ash to having infinite elemental penetration, because elemental penetration can only bring monster resistances down to 0 in POE2, and then also 75% more damage on top of that. That's only against the Arbiter of Ash, and of course, other monsters may end up being different. Probably the biggest change of all is going to be asynchronous trade, the ability to buy items when the seller is offline. That is something that I want to talk a little bit about in its own video. Now, this asynchronous trade is going to both be fantastic, and also it's not quite going to be as fantastic as some people think it will be. Why do I say it's not quite going to be as fantastic as some think? That's because some people think this is the end to all scamming in Path of Exile 2, that all trade scamming will become a thing of the past. That's not correct. What's going to happen is that the forms of trade scams that use the new trade system are going to be different. I do not want to go into full details until I've given really serious thought as to exactly whether it's beneficial to the Path of Exile player base that this information is out in the public. Am I giving more ideas to people who are buying in order to protect themselves? Or am I tilting the balance the other way by giving ideas to people who are interested in scamming and that hadn't thought of some of the attack vectors that I've thought of? So I don't want to outline information on how you would use this if you were a dishonest trader in Path of Exile 2 until I've given that question a lot more thought. Just be aware, when you're buying something, the game is going to force the player to be honest with you on the specific item that you've selected through the trade interface. However, it does not enforce any honesty whatsoever when it comes to any other promises that that seller is making, and you should very, very carefully read every single item that you elect to buy before you commit to the transaction. After that, we have sprinting. Sprinting is going to be one of the biggest game changers. This is probably going to feel a bit clunky because you're going to need to hold down the dodge roll key for a while. For me, that's the spacebar. For other control systems, particularly WASD, I think it may be quite unpleasant, but it's going to be extremely, extremely strong once you get the hang of it. There's going to be 25 new endgame maps. Many of these are going to be based upon zones that are in Act 4 and also in the Interludes. One other thing that's been mentioned is that quite a number of these are more linear than the ones that exist currently on the Endgame Atlas. So the ones that are based on Acts 1, 2, and 3, it's not that every single one of those maps is a terrible maze, but a number of them are. And with these 25 new endgame maps, some of them will be mazes, but there will be more of a bias towards smooth layouts than there is at the moment. Then there's a number of endgame changes, crafting changes, and we'll get to a fair bit of that towards the end of this video, where we're going through roughly the first third of the patch notes, because they are included there. The high tier currency items, so the Uber Exalts, Uber Transmutes and the like. Essence changes, which are really substantial. Essences are basically being redesigned. They won't be good at what they used to be good at. They will be good at new things. And there will be new crafting omens. So that's the recap. Let's jump over to the patch notes themselves. As always, it starts out with a bunch of front matter, and then of course it jumps straight into that infographic that we were just discussing then. And then it goes into much more detail about pretty much everything that we have discussed there, although the class changes and the like, they will not make it into this video. First up, the Third Edict content update is adding Act 4, the next chapter in Path of Exile 2's storyline, which is continuing from Act 3. Doriani has agreed to help you find an ancient weapon that can be used against corruption, the instrument of the Third Edict. Journey to Kingsmarch, hire a ship, and set sail. And of course, those of you that are Path of Exile 1 players and that have played in either 325, 326 or both, you will be aware of Kingsmarch because the players of Path of Exile 1 canonically actually helped build Kingsmarch during 3.25, and that's what the whole expansion was largely about, at least thematically. And you're going to be able to journey to the Namakanui Archipelago, I think I butchered that name there, and this is the home to the Karui tribes. And from there, you'll be able to explore the pristine beaches of Whakapanu Island, the volcanic shores of the Isle of Kin. There are 8 islands to explore, each with its own dangers, and of course, its own bosses. The key thing I think that makes this really different to everything that we've got so far in the game, there is a little bit of non-linearity in Act 2, but Act 4 is completely non-linear. So you can do these 8 islands in whichever order you choose. If you find that your character lines up really, really badly against the monsters that are found in one of them, then you can go and build up some power elsewhere. before coming back to the one that you were struggling with. Or alternately, if you find that one of them's really, really easy for your character, maybe you've got a ranged character and all these monsters are only dangerous up close, but you've got enough damage to kill them before they get close. In that case, you can farm those areas if you think that that's worthwhile to you. Ultimately, that's going to come down to how powerful your character feels at the time. I think once the meta establishes itself, people who are playing meta builds, meta leveling builds at least, will just be able to bowl through these in whatever order they want, and then it will end up being decided by which of the different areas have boosts that provide a character power boost that will speed you up. That'll end up being the speedrunner route, but for everyone else, you can tackle them in whatever order feels most natural. And actually, this is a time for Editing GOG to pop in with a comment and just to say, there will be an established best way to do Act 4. You should only follow that if you know why it's considered to be the best way, and if there's nothing about your character that changes it. So for instance, it might be that the best way ends up being 2, then 4, then 7, then 1, then 3, then 5, then 6, then 8. If that's the case, that's going to be predicated on a number of power assumptions about your character, and if you don't fit those, then you should feel like you don't need to do it that way. You can do it in whatever way feels right for you. Ultimately, the advice that will be discussed the most once we're optimizing Act 4 will be the advice that is right for speedrunners. If you're not a speedrunner, then this advice will become more and more wrong the more that your individual player profile deviates from that of a speedrunner. This is pretty similar to in Path of Exile 1, those of you that play that game as well. You might be aware that when you get to endgame there, you got to work your way through the Atlas of Worlds. There's a number of different ways to do it. There's an accepted best way to do it that pretty much every racer in that game agrees upon, but it's actually a pretty inefficient way for a more casual player to do it. And that's because the casual player is going to find that they're too weak to meet certain objectives that'll be along the way. And as a result, they're going to spend a whole bunch of time trying and failing various bosses that the racer will just absolutely steamroll through a combination of just their increased level of experience with the boss and also the better gear that they're likely to find because they know what to look for gear in. And so the key takeaway here is when advice comes around about which order to do these islands in, follow it if and only if it's advice that is written for a player like yourself. After this, we have the Interludes. So the Third Edict is marking the removal of Cruel difficulty. 3 new temporary interludes are being added, side stories that will take you to level 65, where the endgame begins. So this is that 19 additional zones. Note that this is probably a bit less content than would be in Acts 5 and 6 combined, unless grinding gear games decide to go with the Path of Exile 1 theme, where like Act 10 is the shortest of the acts, but it's not the shortest by a lot, and Act 9 is not super short. So it's not like it's an exact match, but maybe they decide that Acts 5 and 6 are going to be modeled on Act 10 from Path of Exile 1, where it's quite a bit harder than what's come before, but it's also quite a bit shorter, very much more intense. If they go with that route, then you'll end up still having perhaps 19 zones between the end of Act 4 and reaching endgame, but I would say you'll probably have more. And that means that you might find, especially if you're not playing a meta leveling build, and especially early on when meta leveling builds aren't known, you might find that you want to end up repeating some of the zones in the interludes a little bit, just in order to build some character power in order to take on the rest. After this, we have a bunch of discussion in the patch notes about the rise of the Abyssals League. I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail picking this apart because this is one of those sections in the patch notes where I think things will become a bit clearer once we play around with it. But one key difference from Dawn of the Hunt is that in this new expansion, the Rise of the Abyssals League, the Abyss-related content is actually only going to be available in the new Fresh Economy. So all your Legacy Ingenuity belts, all your Legacy Temporalises, all of your Mirror Tier items from 010, 020, if you happen to have any of those, then you will not be able to use them if you jump into 030's Rise of the Abyssals League. But if you prefer, you can keep playing in Standard, but if you do play in Standard, you're not going to have access to the new Abyss content that's being added in 030. This is how Grinding Gear Games tends to do things in Path of Exile 1 as well. The newest content tends to only be available in the Fresh Economy for a few months, and then after that, it gets put into Standard in some form most of the time, and occasionally they decide, like they did with the Crucible expansion in Path of Exile 1, nah, we're not going to bother integrating this into the core game at all. Start fresh in a new economy with the Rise of the Abyssals League. All of your old characters from the Early Access launch, and this also includes Dawn of the Hunt, are still present, but a free passive tree refund will be granted to each of them due to the major changes that are taking place. We'd highly encourage you to join the new leagues to fully take in the changes we've made in 030. Created by forbidden necromantic magic during the Age of the Precursors, the Abyssal have been biding their time underground. Now, obeying the will of their general, they're emerging from the depths through fissures spreading across all of Rayclast. Fight this ancient evil, seal the fissures, and resist the rise of the Abyssals in Path of Exile 2's first full league. In your travels throughout Rayclast, you'll encounter fissures in the ground. These are going to sap the life force of monsters above them. Slaying these monsters will trigger the Abyssal to emerge, enhanced with extra necromantic abilities from those whose power they were draining. You'll need to defeat these uber versions of rare monsters and uber versions of other monsters in order to close the Abyss. Abysses will vary in size, power, and variety as you go through the game. Closing them will reveal Abyssal Troves, which will have various loot in them, and will sometimes allow you to travel underground to engage with the Abyssal directly. As you close the Abysses, you may find ancient bones which can be used to imbue your items with Abyssal magic, adding hidden Abyssal modifiers. Using the Well of Souls, which you will discover in Act 2, and we'll come back to this in a sec, you can reveal a Desecrated modifier and choose to transform it by selecting one of 3 different options. So this is equivalent to veiled items from Path of Exile 1, with one very important change. During the campaign, this will allow you to more easily craft additional regular modifiers onto your items, and during the endgame, new and powerful mods that were not previously possible to craft will be unlocked. The Well of Souls can also be used to augment your Waystones, granting them new modifiers that will push difficulty and rewards to new heights. Now, the thing here that is going to need a week 1 patch. The Well of Souls is a cool idea, but you're going to have to basically go there every time you want to unveil an item, and I'm using the Path of Exile 1 terminology here. That's where you choose between 3 different mods to add to an item. In Path of Exile 1, for a long period of time, there was a hideout NPC that did this for you, so that was more convenient than having to go to a particular zone in Act 2, especially with Path of Exile 2's long load screens. And on top of that, the process ended up being made even faster. In a recent patch, I think it might have been 3.26, it might have been 3.25, where they changed it so that you didn't need to go to that NPC anymore. You could just simply right-click the item and then choose between the options. Really, I think you should have to go to the Well of Souls once, and after that, you should be able to right-click these items in order to just finish them off and make them usable straight away. I hope that this gets patched before the league goes live. If it doesn't get patched before the league goes live, it's going to be the most demanded week 1 patch, unless there's something massively on fire. So definitely something that is in need of a fix there. After this, delve into the abyssal depths, swarming with legions of the undead and guarding powerful rewards. Discover an ominous ancient spire and challenge the abyssal commanders in their attempt to plunge Rayclast into a lightless void. Now the next line talks about some of the difficulty settings that you can choose between, so you'll be able to choose between standard, hardcore and solo self-found variations of the Rise of the Abyssals League. However, I would assume that what they intend here is that actually you can go trade enabled or solo self-found, your choice, and independently you can choose between softcore and hardcore. So essentially 4 different variations, rather than the 3 that are implied by the precise wording Grinding Gear Games have used here. I would definitely expect that you will be able to pick to run neither, either, or both of those alternate, more difficult rule sets. On top of this, every version of it will have the same items available. Also, every version will have the same mechanics available. So there's not going to be anything that's a solo self-found exclusive or hardcore mode exclusive like they used to do in the very early days of Path of Exile 1. And you'll be able to create private league versions of these leagues. Private leagues can be a lot of fun. This is a situation where you don't have the entirety of the player base in one place. Instead, it's something that is limited to you and people that you invite to the league. Unfortunately, they get fairly expensive once they get beyond a certain size. The marginal cost per player is 6 Path of Exile store points. And so that's something that ends up getting pretty expensive once you start having an event that has hundreds of players in it. Private leagues, though, are definitely great, and I'd urge people to keep them in mind, especially if Grinding Gear Games run promos on them, like they did in Path of Exile 1 during May of this year. The reasons I tend to like private leagues so much is that there's the sense of community still. You're able to cooperate with other players. It's advantageous to cooperate with other players. You can trade and the like, but at the same time, there's not so many players that things like Meritia crafting become viable. And when there's Meritia crafting, it ends up really funneling a lot of certain resources like Omens of Whittling. They funnel up to the top. Very few players are able to use them as well as someone that is a Meritia crafter can. And so in the trade league, Meritia crafters just have the ability to buy up enormous amounts of these resources. Whereas in a private league, there's probably only a small amount of them, and there's not enough for them to concentrate into one person's massive wealth for one massive craft, and instead they just end up being things people use themselves. That's one of the things I really like about the private league system, but ultimately, like I said, it can be quite expensive. Anyways, this is a little bit of an aside. Let's get back to the character balance overhaul. Major character balance overhaul. Now, this is not detailed here. This comes up much later. We're making very significant changes to character balance across the entire game. Our goal is to increase build diversity by making many more skills and character archetypes viable into the endgame. Parts 2 and, if necessary, Part 3 of this deep dive into the patch notes, they're going to cover that because there is just so much. And ultimately, if I try to force everything into one video, I'm not going to be able to do a proper job of the balance overhaul. Support gem system overhaul. Now, we discussed this very briefly earlier on when I talked about my apprehensions with it, but let's go through some of the details here. Support gems are an area that got some of the most significant changes to the core design. They're what enables so many interesting mechanics and different ways to play, but POE2's support gem system has just never been quite right. One of the major issues is the limitation of only having one support gem of each type on your character. We didn't want builds to become just using the same 5 most powerful supports on every skill. We also wanted to encourage you to combo your abilities. We have removed the restriction of having one of each support gem per character. You can now use as many copies as you like. Many supports now have multiple tiers as you progress through the endgame, providing different stat values, additional stats, or perhaps working a bit different to their lower tier counterparts. Due to these changes, many existing support gems, which will now be tier 1 for cases where multiple tiers now exist, have received small numerical balance changes, and the effects of some support gems have been combined into a single gem. We've added 11 new support gems in 030. We've also added 40 lineage supports, much more powerful supports that are only available in endgame. A further comment on lineage supports that only really applies to those of you that are in endgame in Path of Exile 1. I am generally thinking of these as being somewhat akin to Awaken supports from Path of Exile 1, but unlike Path of Exile 1's Awaken supports, where they have to do something that is fundamentally similar to an existing gem, instead they can do something that is wildly different as well. So in Path of Exile 1, you've got Awaken Fork, which is Fork but better. In Path of Exile 2, a lineage support might just do something entirely different to Fork, even if it was thematically close to it. Next up, a number of support gems are being outright deleted. These are no longer going to be able to be engraved, and existing gems will go splat when you log in. These are Blood in the Eyes, which is an extremely complicated support gem. It requires you to be doing physical damage, inflicting bleed, and also to care about hobbling enemies, which means that either you're an Amazon or you're not accuracy capped. If you're in that situation, then this is going to be a sad loss for you. I don't think there's going to be very many people in that situation. Discombobulate is next. This supports attacks and causes them to build up days based upon a portion of physical damage dealt, and this one is going away. Unsteady Tempo was a very complicated gem that was causing you to gain different bonuses on your first, second, and third attack, and then after that it would reset and give you the benefit to the first attack again. Unbending provided a very small amount of mana recovery conditional upon being hit while you were actively casting the spell. Untouchable provided you with a bonus to your evasion rating while you were actively making an attack, and the amount of evasion rating you got as a bonus was conditional upon how long it was taking you to actually unleash that skill. And Unyielding was the same principle, but was tied to life recoup instead of evasion rating. So those ones are going away, and I'm sure it's a very sad day for the 3 people that ever used them. After this, updated the wording for support gems that added a cooldown to supported skills. This has not resulted in a change in functionality with the exception of Expanse support, which incorrectly was providing a 6-second cooldown but stated that it was providing 8. It now correctly has an 8-second cooldown instead. Updated the description of Last Gasp support to mention that supported minions die before the support's duration expires if they take damage exceeding their maximum life when fatally wounded. This functionality was already present, but previously it wasn't mentioned. Support gems that support skills you use yourself are no longer capable of supporting persistent skills. They can still support gems that have both a persistent component and a manually activated component, such as Plague Bearer. And I will say one of the most confusing things about playing Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 both is that you wind up thinking in your head, oh, this is what Plague Bearer does in Path of Exile 1, and then in Path of Exile 2, you go in expecting it to do exactly the same thing, when, of course, it has its own nuances. It's not the same gem. This happens a lot of times, and it is definitely very confusing. In addition, we fixed a bug where numerous supports which could support skills you use yourself could support skills that were being used by totems or by triggered skills. They no longer do so unless they specify otherwise. Clarified the wording of muster support to refer specifically to the number of different reviving minions that you have. This is not a functional change. So this is one of those things where they're clarifying wording that a lot of people are misinterpreting, and just making it clear that the wording now explicitly excludes the cases that people erroneously thought that it had. Having a skill with socketed support gems you do not meet the attribute requirements for now disables just those supports instead of turning off the entire skill. This is a huge improvement for corner case situations. It's not going to matter all the time, but every now and again you're going to accidentally take off a piece of equipment without realizing it causes a bit of a chain reaction that renders other skills unusable. And while you're trying to fix that, this is going to stop you from being completely unable to use a whole swathe of your skills. You might still end up with a lot of problems if your highest stat ends up falling under the new requirement for gem level 20 skills, or whatever gem level you happen to be up to in progression at the time. But I think that this is much worse of a problem when it came to taking off the only source of dexterity you've got on your character, and then suddenly your dexterity support gems aren't working anymore, and you're in a whole world of problem. And the various infusion support gems, such as Lightning Attunement here, which was previously called Lightning Infusion, these are all being renamed to be Attunement rather than Infusion. Now, there's two reasons for this name change. The first one is they want to reuse the name Lightning Infusion for something that is much more clearly a Lightning Infusion. The second reason is that actually Attunement was always a better name for these gems. That's because this gem is saying, hey, I want to really attune this to be a lightning skill, and I'm going to do so fully aware that this is going to impact my ability to deal cold and fire damage with it. And there's the equivalent sort of mechanics that are tied to the other versions of the infusion gems as well. Well, Attunement felt like a better name all along. That's part of the reason, but later we'll get to what they're doing with infusions because it's kind of a cool new mechanic that's being added. And the same is true, of course, for cold, fire, and chaos infusion, which are all now attunements as well. Now, there's a number of new skills. Skills are something that can have a transformative effect on builds when they're added to the game, and so they're worth having a quick look at, but it is important to note that we can't really judge these until we get hard numbers on them. The sorts of numbers you want to look for here are going to be things that are actually made clear, like the amount of damage that they do, their cooldowns, their cast times or attack times and the like, but also a couple of things that may not be clear, such as their damage projection patterns. Where are they hitting? Are they hitting a small area in front of your character? In that case, unless the damage is extraordinary, the skill is probably dead on arrival. Or are they hitting multiple areas of the screen? In which case, it's much more impressive. So, we have a new strength skill gem, Fortifying Cry. Perform a war cry that grants guard. So guard is this game's version of temporary hit points. It's something that sits over and above your energy shield and your life, and it gets consumed first, and causes subsequent shield attacks to release an empowered shockwave when dealing damage. This skill's cooldown can be bypassed by expending an endurance charge. Here, you're going to need to have endurance charge generation somewhere on your character in order to use this well. Otherwise, you can just potentially use it once in a blue moon as a last resort. The Warcry is going to provide you with a burst of extra defense immediately. And because this is just essentially flat additional hit points in the form of guard, this is going to be a powerful defensive emergency layer for attacks you know are coming. Not going to be any use if you're caught off guard though, because Warcries take time to execute. Then it causes your subsequent shield attacks to release an empowered shockwave when dealing damage. This is something that could be built around, but we really need to know just how much damage does that empowered shockwave do. Is it going to be something that turns a shield charge from just tickling enemies into outright destroying them? In that case, this could be really, really strong. Or is it just going to be an insult to add on top of the real injury that comes from the baseline skill? How big is that empowered shockwave? These are the questions we don't really have answers to yet. They're going to be the ones to look for when gem numbers come out here. Added a new strength skill gem, Forge Hammer. Hurl a fiery hammer that slams into the ground and lodges there. When the hammer is lodged in the ground, reusing this skill recalls the hammer and resets the skill's cooldown. So that's basically summon your hammer back if you want. Alternately, you can lock in that cooldown, so you can give up on the option to reset the cooldown by using a Warcry anywhere near the lodged hammer. And if you do that, the hammer is going to shatter and it's going to release a number of molten fissures in a spiral. Now this looked like it's a fairly localized AoE from the video that we saw of this, so I don't think this is going to be something you're going to want to be using as a primary clear skill, but it is something that might be good against tanky rares and the like. You can throw this down at them, then you can war cry, and if you happen to be using a one-handed hammer and a shield, then maybe you would feel it's appropriate to then use a Fortifying Cry to trigger this, and then at that point shield charge towards the enemy. That's an option, but there's going to be lots of other things you can do. You're definitely not locked into one-handed hammers and shields. You might use a two-handed hammer instead. And so there's a whole bunch of options that you've got. This sounds interesting, but I don't think it's got the damage projection to be your primary skill. This is going to be something that you'll have for heavy damage on single targets. Next, we have another strength skill gem, Ancestral Cry. Perform a war cry using glory that you gain by igniting enemies. Now, glory is essentially a glorified way, let's see what I did there, of tracking the amount of enemies that you've inflicted some sort of status ailment on. So in this case, that status is going to be Ignite. You will get 1 point of glory for setting a normal monster on fire, and you'll get increasingly larger amounts for setting more powerful enemies on fire. Magic, rare, unique monsters. Now, this is going to take an enormous amount of glory build up in order to go off. So this is going to be one of those things you're probably only going to want to trigger on extraordinary situations in a map. This is not going to be something you'll use very often. You'll use it on map bosses. You'll use it when there is a particularly heinous rare monster, but I don't think you're going to be using this even on just ordinary rare monsters. This is very much a big cooldown effect. Now, this is going to turn you into an embodiment of calm. While embodying calm, your footsteps are going to trigger volcanic steps, melee strikes and slams that are ancestrally boosted, which cause them to be much more effective, and your melee attack hits trigger volcanic eruption. Essentially, you just become a localized catastrophe for a short period of time. This is not something that you can sustain, and as a result, it's something to use in an emergency, or something to set off very early in a boss fight in order to be able to do a whole bunch of extra damage there. After that, if the numbers that were mentioned in the live stream announcement end up being accurate, you're going to need to set that boss on fire again 5 times in order to use it again, and that's not something that's trivial to do. So this is one of those gems that is very, very niche, something that in Path of Exile 1 would either flat out never be used, or it would be the Vaal version associated with a normal skill, and maybe you're normally using the normal version of the skill, then once in a blue moon, you fire up the Vaal version. That's the role that Ancestral Cry is going to play. Most people probably won't be interested, but I do think it might lead to some fun moments for people that do play around with it. After that, a new dexterity skill gem, Toxic Domain. This creates an area of toxic bloom on the ground around you. While you're in this bloom, you have increased skill costs, regenerate life, and your projectile attacks attach a toxic pustule, which can be poisoned. Pustules will detonate after a duration or when enough poison has been applied to them, and this is going to then deal damage and apply poison in an area around it. This is one of those gems that really needs to be played with to see if it's any good or not. It does something inherently interesting, but it's also not clear how bad that increased skill cost effect is going to be. Is that going to be something that means that you just start really quickly running out of mana while you're using this, or is it going to be something that's much more manageable? Ultimately, it's a reward for standing still on an archer and also taking the time to set up an area that you're going to fight from, which is not a playstyle that you would always use, but it's definitely one that can be used when it's situationally appropriate. Added a new dexterity skill gem, Ice-Tipped Arrows. Ready your active bow or spear, empowering your next barrageable bow or spear projectile attacks to create ice fragments on hit. This skill's cooldown can be bypassed by expending a frenzy charge. So what this is doing, this is an 8-second cooldown, and it's going to provide a buff where for just a small number of attacks, you're going to be able to inflict these ice fragments on hit. These can then be exploded, so this is going to be something that's inherently combo-only use. A new intelligence skill gem, Frost Darts. This conjures a number of icy projectiles that launch towards the target. Projectiles that hit a chilled or frozen target are going to create chunks of ice that deal additional damage on impacting the ground. This is going to consume a cold infusion if possible. Now, cold infusions are something that will be covered later on in the patch notes. They were mentioned by Grindy Games in the live stream though. They're something that enable you to feed additional cold energy into an existing spell. So it consumes a cold infusion if possible to cause each of these projectiles to lodge into an enemy, then explode. This, of course, is another reason that they ended up renaming the attunement gems from infusion to attunement instead. Added a new strength persistent buff gem, Iron Ward. When active, this is going to store a percentage of physical damage that is prevented by your armor or other sources of damage mitigation. Using this skill releases the stored damage as a nova of spikes. This could be really interesting, but it's going to live or die based upon the numbers on it. Can't really say anything more than that. If the numbers on it are terrible, no one's going to care. But if the numbers on this are right, this could be something that is a good way to retaliate after you've taken a lot of small hits. Remember in Path of Exile 2, and also 1 for that matter, armor is at its best when you're being hit by small amounts of damage. And so if you get swarmed by a lot of weaker enemies, then this is just going to obliterate those packs. If the damage projection on it is good, and if the numbers on it are good. Next up, there is a new Strength Dexterity based persistent buff gem, Mortar Cannon. This is going to raise a cannon totem which uses socketed grenade skills with significantly improved cooldown recovery rate. This one's interesting. Like anything else that allows you to deploy attacks through a proxy, it's going to be unclear as to exactly how good it is until we see the numbers on it. So Editing GOG popping in here, one thing that comes up with this skill that I think is a use and that might be underestimated by Path of Exile 1 players. In Path of Exile 1, it's completely unreasonable to have skills that you only have on your hotbar for extremely niche situations. And that's because there's only so many gems that you can fit on your character. It's something like 25 or so that you can fit on your character entirely. And each one of them is pretty precious because they're going to be linked to each other. So realistically, you can only have like 4 or 5 skills that you've heavily linked on a character, whereas in Path of Exile 2, you can have a lot of skills that are heavily linked. What this means is that you could conceivably drop down some mortar cannons just before a corner, if you're aware that around the corner there's some really, really terrifyingly strong monster, and then you can go around the corner and deliver mortar cannon direct to its door, rather than putting yourself at risk. So that's something that you can use to soften up enemies. Would you use this often? No. Might you occasionally use this? Yes, especially if you encounter some horrifyingly difficult monster early in progression. So keep in mind, there are a few things that you can do because it is perfectly fine in Path of Exile 2 to have a skill that you only use for 1% of the time that you're playing the game. Is perfectly fine to allocate a skill there if it is going to be useful sometimes, and Mortar Cannon should be assessed on that basis. Mirage Archer is next, and the numbers on this one did, however, look good. Dexterity Persistent Buff Gem. While this is active, dodge rolling is going to create a Mirage that uses socketed ranged attacks for a short duration, then vanishes. You cannot create another Mirage while one exists, or for a short time after one vanishes. Dodge rolling when you're unable to create a new Mirage will restart this timer. Now this is going to be one of those gems that is going to feel much stronger if you have an extremely high mechanical level of play skill. In particular, what you're going to need in order to optimize this is a bit of a counter in your mind as to how long it's been since you last dodge rolled. And the way that you would probably do this in the real world, rather than just trying to keep track of that in your head, is going to be through the use of some sort of metronome app on a phone, or alternately, a real physical metronome. A metronome being one of those physical devices that musicians use if they want it to tick a certain number of times per minute to track beats of a song. So for instance, they might have it at 101 beats per minute or 103 beats per minute for various songs, like Another One Bites the Dust or Stayin' Alive. Or alternately, for something in the Path of Exile environment, you might be thinking, okay, I want this to tick once every 1.1 seconds because I've got a 6.3 second cooldown. I'm going to round that up a little bit to 6.6 because it's better to overshoot than undershoot the cooldown on this. And as a result, I want it to tick once every 1.1 seconds, which is 55 times a minute. And then every 6 ticks, that's going to mean that it's time that I can dodge roll again. And then that'll refresh the Mirage Archer, or at least it'll create a new one at my feet. The problem you're going to find with this though, and the behavior we really need to test with this gem, is how exactly it works when you've moved away from a Mirage Archer. How far away do you need to get for the Mirage Archer to despawn? For example, if you run 20 meters away from your Mirage Archer and then you dash roll again, does that cause you to spawn the new Mirage Archer? Or does it refresh the existing one? If it refreshes the existing one, that's actually kind of terrible because that thing is so far away that it's not able to affect you at all, and you don't want that happening. The precise implementation of how this leashing works is going to determine a lot as to how good Mirage Archer is, but I do think that what we've seen so far, the numbers on it are so good that it's probably going to be worthwhile using. But if you don't have a metronome, or you're not willing to go to the extent of using a metronome while you're playing in order to track this, then you probably want to err on the side of overshooting, especially if it's that most unforgiving implementation of the way that it refreshes. I feel like this gem is going to be a 7 out of 10 for people who are not willing to go to the extent of engaging with using a metronome, precise timing and the like. And for people that are willing to, it's going to be a 10 out of 10 or even better than that. It's just going to be absolutely over the top power if you're willing to really go to the extents necessary to get perfect utilization out of Mirage Archer. Added a new intelligence persistent buff gem, Ravenous Swarm. While this is active and enemies are nearby, swarms of insects emerge from your body to pursue enemies. The swarms are untargetable minions that periodically attack and poison enemies within the swarm. Now this sounds like it's something that enables minion builds to deal with enemies that get up close and personal, and potentially do so without recalling all of their minions to them. Is this going to be good? I don't know. It's going to live or die based upon the numbers on it. We don't have those numbers. Added a new intelligence persistent buff gem, Siphon Elements. While this is active, it has a chance to generate an infusion remnant when you freeze, shock, or ignite a target. These are those infusions we were talking about before, the ones that caused the attunement gems to get renamed, and also the ones that had a couple of other interactions we've discussed already, and there'll be plenty more of them later. Next we have Grim Feast. This gem was completely and utterly busted in 010, so much so that it was pretty much entirely turned off for 020. It has been completely reworked and re-enabled. Instead of granting anything related to Energy Shield, it now allows you to collect remnants from your dead reviving minions, then activate the skill to instantly revive minions based upon their maximum life. What Grim Feast is now asking you is how much top-end performance are you willing to sacrifice in order to pick up consistency. The effect of this is going to grant you consistency because you're going to be able to revive minions that might otherwise die and then take a while to come back, and also have that further disrupted by other minions dying and all sorts of things going wrong. So it is something that can improve your bottom end performance, but it does so at the expense of lowering your top end performance, because the resource you're going to use for Grim Feast is likely going to be Spirit. And that is going to mean an opportunity cost of not spending that same Spirit on summoning additional minions. Now, this is going to live or die based upon how high that Spirit cost is, and also just how reliably you can resurrect your minions. It might end up being that this cost is worth paying. It might end up being that this cost is not worth paying. What will definitely be the case is that every single build that involves minions will look better in Path of Building if you take Grim Feast out of it. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that this will be bad in the real world. That's the sort of thing that we can only find out from playtesting, not from theory crafting and not from modeling. Next, we have a number of Keystone passives that are being added. These are the passives that have a big upside and a big downside, and they tend to transform the way that you build characters. Added a new Keystone passive skill to the northwest of the Monk starting location, Hollow Palm Technique. Path of Exile 1 players might recognize this name as the unarmed Keystone that's only available in conjunction with an endgame unique item. This Keystone allows you to use quarterstaff attacks while unarmed, and grants those attacks additional benefits while used unarmed. So the whole idea here is that it provides you with the ability to make an unarmed attack build if you want, and it'll live or die based upon what those numbers are. What are these additional attack benefits when being used unarmed? When we've got those numbers locked in, then we'll be able to say more about how good Hollow Palm Technique is or is not. Often it's the case though that it's very strong to start with one of these unarmed builds, and then to transition away from that build once you can get your hands on an endgame weapon, because they do tend to be better, not in every situation, but in many, than playing an unarmed setup. Ritual Cadence is the next Keystone passive that's being added. This is going to be northeast of the Witch and Sorceress starting location, and it deals with triggered skills. This Keystone changes your invocations to trigger skills every 2 seconds instead of all at once. So that is a pretty severe drawback in most situations. However, triggered skills consume less energy, which is going to mean that you'll be able to trigger more of them. Is this going to be worth it? Overwhelmingly, the answer is going to be no, but there will be the occasional build where the answer is yes. And that's where I like having some of these kind of niche options that are added to the game. After this, there is another Keystone that's being added, and this is Blackflame Covenant. This is going to be northwest of the Witch and Sorceress starting location, and this one is all about converting fire into chaos. Now, this Keystone is going to convert fire damage to chaos damage, with this damage contributing to ignite chance and ignite magnitude. And also, ignites that are inflicted with fire skills are going to deal chaos damage instead. This is something, of course, that is very thematically linked to the unique item Blackflame, which is available both in Path of Exile 2 and also a related item in Path of Exile 1 that is very, very similar as well. Also in the north of the tree, but this time east of the Monk's location, Walker of the Winds. This Keystone causes mana leech to recover based on elemental damage types instead of physical damage. So the idea here is that if you're playing a Monk build and you're having trouble with mana sustain, this is an option that you can use, but only if you're dealing elemental damage primarily, which is very common on Monk builds. After this, we jump into some of the biggest changes of all, and this is the new currency orbs. These are going to start dropping from late in the campaign and into maps. Greater Orb of Transmutation, Perfect Orb of Transmutation, Greater Orb of Augmentation, Perfect Orb of Augmentation. Now, I believe that these ones so far that we've mentioned, they have the text for Greater Orb of Transmutation, adds 1 mod to a normal item and makes it magic. This mod that's added cannot be lower than level 50, or maybe it's 55. And those levels are the level that's required for the mod to spawn on an item. The perfect versions of these two currency items are actually level 75, which is better again. Then we have the ones that apply to items and leave the output rare, and they're worse. They're going to have lower numbers in those situations, but they're still going to be good items. The Greater Chaos Orb, the Perfect Chaos Orb, Greater Regal Orb, Perfect Regal Orb, Greater Exalted Orb, Perfect Exalted Orb. All of these are going to be really strong. Essentially, I see this as a create your own tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 rare item late in the game. The better than an item base is, the more important it's going to be to consider using perfect tier currencies on it. However, there is a really awkward spot in progression for gear, and this is early maps and also late campaign, where you're not really getting very many upgrades and it's kind of difficult to craft them. Well, these are going to be perfect in that section of the game as well. So if you're in very early maps and you happen to come across a Greater Orb of Transmutation or a Greater Chaos Orb or Greater Regal Orb or whatever, you're going to be able to use that on the right type of base of an item and try and create something. It's not guaranteed to be perfect, but it should be just substantially higher quality than most of the items that are dropping on the ground for you. And as a result, you should be able to craft more of your own items. The one problem that I think is going to come up here is going to be imbalanced resistances. Like for instance, if you're in a situation where you really desperately need cold resistance on your character, maybe you're sitting around with only plus 20%, you really desperately need it, and then you loot a Greater Orb of Transmutation and you're like, oh, fantastic, this is going to solve the problem, and then you apply it to your item and it's like, oh, high tier lightning resist. That's going to be disappointing when that happens. Ultimately, the rune system partially ameliorates this, but it's not quite enough, and these are not going to completely solve everything, but I do think they're going to be a big boost to that section of crafting. Also, if you get really lucky with Perfect Exalted Orbs, and I do think that this is going to make Perfect Exalted Orbs quite desirable at endgame, those are going to potentially put really good mods onto items. And so we go from a currency item that's being added for the everyday player to something that is being added not just to the top 1%, but to the top 0.1%. Hinekora's locks. These exist in Path of Exile 1 as well. In Path of Exile 1, they are the second most expensive currency item behind the Mirror of Kalandra, and they're a very large fraction of a Mirror of Kalandra. Typically something like a fifth of a mirror or so in trade value. Don't know that they'll be quite as high in POE2. There's a few less uses for them, but they are still extraordinarily strong. What they let you do is see the outcomes of a craft before committing to it. But not only can you do that, but you can actually test a whole bunch of different orbs on an item. So for instance, you could test what's going to happen if I Chaos Orb this item, what's going to happen if I Exalt it, what's going to happen if I Greater Exalt it, what's going to happen if I Perfect Exalt it, what's going to happen if I apply such and such an essence to it, if essences can be applied to it, what's going to happen with all the various Abyss Bones if I apply one of them to it, and then once you've done that, you can then say, hey, one of these is fantastic. I've just worked out that if I apply a Vaal Orb to the item, it's going to end up fantastic. I can actually commit to it. Now with a Hinekora's Lock, if you don't like any of the outcomes, you can then go and change the item's future by applying a currency orb that doesn't really do anything much to the item. So in Path of Exile 1, people often use Blessed Orbs for this. In POE2, you might be forced to use quality modifying currency here or something else along those lines, but that can then be used to reset it. So the Hinekora's Lock Foresight will then disappear. It'll be like you never used a Hina Lock, but if you then use another Hina Lock on the item, then it will have different outcomes. This won't be as strong as it is in POE1 where there are so many more crafting options, but I do think it'll be an extremely valuable tool, And it'll be something that if you're a casual player and you get one of these, which you probably won't because they'll be so rare you won't, but if you do, then your best use is going to be to sell it to someone that's doing a merit tier craft. Same really as Omens of Whittling. These are used in the top end deterministic crafts, and as a result, they end up getting priced out of the range of everyone else. And honestly, that'll be the case whatever drop rate they end up getting. Where they end up being somewhere in the range of 4 to 10 times as common as a mirror as they are in Path of Exile 1, or even if they were to end up being 100 times as common as a mirror, I still think you'd find the best use case for the everyday player that gets one of these is going to be to sell it to someone much richer than yourself. After that, the patch notes mention a number of new items that are being added to the game, but with next to no details. 10 new uniques, 50 new base item types, which is interesting, 20 new endgame maps, and 15 new omens. This is followed by a section on endgame changes. There's a number of sweeping changes here, but let's just start with the elephant that is not present in the room. There is no sweeping overhaul to the tower system. There is no sweeping overhaul to the system whereby you've got rollable precursor tablets, and the best rolls on those precursor tablets allow so much juicing and stack in such favorable ways that it ends up completely eclipsing all other endgame farming. Unfortunately, that didn't make it into 0.3, which is a disappointment. I would have liked to have seen changes at the very least to the mods that can roll on precursor tablets. I think that would have been an improvement so that they don't stack quite as high as they do now. Anyways, let's go through what is going to be changing. Firstly, Pinnacle, boss, content, and access keys. Currently, they're using the same access key to access Arbiter of Ash level 0, Arbiter of Ash level 1, 2, 3, or 4, and this is causing the same problems in POE2 that the similar system caused in Path of Exile 1, which is that it just ends up that one of these is mathematically favorable, one of these is economically more favorable. It's almost always to sell the access tokens to someone that's running +4 version, and as a result, you end up having this negative feeling where at lower difficulties, instead of wanting to run the content yourself, you're often better off just selling it to someone that can run it at maximum difficulty. Now, what they've decided to do with this is a change that I'm not sure it's going to work, but let's go through the actual details of it. This does not apply to the Arbiter of Ash. The Arbiter of Ash is receiving different changes. So, each of these types of content are going to drop splinters. This is going to remove some of the RNG aspects of these encounters. So for instance, instead of an RNG chance for Olroth to spawn in a logbook, it's now going to be a number of splinters that will get you deterministic access to Olroth. So these splinters are not going to form into a singular access key. Instead of using the singular combined item in the realm gate, as was the case in 0.10.0.20, you now bring your splinters. Upon inserting the splinters into the realm gate, an interface will appear that allows you to choose a difficulty level, and each difficulty level has its own entry cost. Now, I still think it's going to be the case that one of these is going to be mathematically superior to the others. It may not always be the hardest difficulty version of the fight, and that I think is going to cause a different type of feels bad. But ultimately, this is what we've got for 0.30. Ultimately, I think a far better approach would be something akin to what exists in Path of Exile 1, where the entry tokens that buy you access into the regular version of the Searing Exarch fight, this comes from regular mapping, and then the entry tokens that let you attempt the Uber version of the Searing Exarch, which is far, far harder, this comes from the very hardest tier of maps only. I don't think they've got it flawless in Path of Exile 1 either, but I do think that's better than what they've got in Path of Exile 2. The one improvement though, the one thing Path of Exile 2 is doing a lot better than Path of Exile 1 here, is having some consistency, so you don't need to learn a whole bunch of exceptions. I have a video that's a Voidstone guide for Path of Exile 1, and it gets a lot of people searching for it, because all of the different bosses that you need to fight in order to get your Voidstones, which are key steps forward in endgame in Path of Exile 1, pretty much all of them have different mechanisms to gain access to those fights, and as a result, you kind of need to research all of them individually. And that's something that's really complex, especially given that some of it is quite old content, and when it was first added to the game, it had different mechanics to what it's got now. Anyways, I'm very easily distracted and go off on tangents. Let me stop myself here and get back to what you actually want to know about, which is the patch notes for this league. As a result of this change, the corresponding Atlas passive trees no longer affect the difficulty of the content, and they're being changed to purely affect the content in maps on the Atlas. I really like this change. I really didn't like the way that with the old system, if you wanted to spec into Breach, but you weren't very strong at actually fighting Zesh, so you weren't playing a bossing oriented character, you're playing a character that was just really good at mapping. You kind of wanted to run around with 8 points allocated into the breach tree. Then if you did want to go to fight Zesht, maybe you wanted to learn some more about the fight, then when you did that, you kind of needed to unspec those points because you wanted to do it at a lower difficulty. And ultimately, that was a feel bad moment, a really awkward thing, and this is just a better way of doing it. Now, items that currently exist in permanent leagues, simulacrums, breachstones, audiences for the king, these can be right-clicked to grant 100 of the appropriate type of splinter. The Arbiter of Ash is an exception. This one is going to stay different. The Arbiter of Ash is now a static difficulty encounter with infinite portals. Previously, only infinite portals at difficulty 0. The rewards of this fight match the previous difficulty 4 rewards. The Arbiter of Ash passive skill tree has been removed. Some of the bonuses, but not all of them most likely. Almost certainly not the bonuses that granted additional items from the Arbiter of Ash's loot pool. These are going to become inherent to the Arbiter of Ash's drops. There is now an Uber version of the Arbiter of Ash boss fight. This is going to require new versions of the fragments to access. The Calamity fragments are going to be obtained from Citadel bosses. They're only available when you've allocated the maximum number of points in your boss Atlas passive tree, ensuring these Citadels are fought at their highest possible difficulty. Now, it's interesting to note here that this is modeled on what they do in Path of Exile 1. It's not exactly the same, but essentially you've got this way of saying, all right, this Citadel, it's got to be a high tier map, it's got to be juiced up to the max, and then it's going to grant you a Calamity fragment instead. This is somewhat akin to Path of Exile 1, where tier 17 maps, they give you a fragment for the Uber Searing Exarch instead of giving you progress towards a regular Searing Exarch. Or maybe it's one of the other Pinnacle bosses. Whatever the case, you get tokens for hardest bosses from running the hardest mapping content. Now, there are some pretty big changes to unlocking that map boss Atlas passive section of the tree. These are being changed so that you now gain them firstly by slaying a map boss in a level 79 plus map that has at least 6 modifiers. So 79 means tier 15. The second one comes from an area level 80 or above map that has 6 modifiers. The third one comes from an anomaly map boss, so that's one of the new special things that's being added, in an area level 79 plus map that has at least 6 modifiers. And then there's a Citadel is the next one after that. Now, it's important to note here, something that I don't think is very clear is what happens if your very first map that you do that is 6 modifiers and has a boss in it is actually an anomaly or a Citadel. Do you get progress for the first point and the third point, or the first point and the fourth point, or do you only get the first point? This is something I'd like to see some clarification on. It'll be found out by players pretty early in progression. It's just going to feel pretty unpleasant. If you do one of these anomalies, you're really proud of your achievement, but then you've got to do another one of them later. After that, completing the Pinnacle Flame quest, i.e. killing the Arbiter, that will grant you the additional points that are available in that Atlas tree. Olroth no longer spawns in logbooks. And next we have these mysterious anomalies. Mysterious anomalies are a really interesting thing that's being added. These are bosses that are hard, but they're a step down from the Citadel bosses. They're going to be based upon bosses that are found in the Interludes or potentially in Act 4. So these are going to be some new rewards for just exploring the overworld on the Atlas. And hopefully this breaks the solved system that we've got at the moment. So currently we have this meta where it is solved that the best way to deal with towers is to bunker down in one location after you've unlocked all the points on your Atlas, and then do everything that you can in that one location using overlapping towers. But maybe if these mysterious anomalies are good enough, maybe that will unsolve the endgame for us. I'm not super confident it will, but that's the hope. We'll find that out. Probably the single biggest change to endgame though is one that we're saving for now. Modifiers on Waystones have been completely reworked. Every modifier comes with a downside. Example, monsters deal 20% of damage as extra cold, and then a related upside. And when I say related, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's thematically linked. So it's not 10% to monster pack size, but these new monsters are cold monsters. It's just 10% to monster pack size. That is tied to 20% of damage added as extra cold. And they'll also have some amount of additional Waystone drop chance. This is a big change because previously a lot of things came down to RNG on higher tier maps as to whether or not you got the rarity buff, whether or not you got certain other prefixes that were miles ahead of anything else that you could roll on a mod. Downside modifiers have been made weaker to account for the ability to have more of them present than before. This is really important because we're going to be talking at a later point. This won't make it into video number 1. This will be in one of the sequels. But we're going to be talking about some of the changes that are taking place to armor. And in particular, there are new mods that can spawn on items whereby armor can apply to elemental damage, but only a portion of your armor does so. What this downside modifiers have been made weaker means is that you're going to be finding a bunch of map mods such as monsters deal 20% of damage as extra cold. These are going to add small chunks of elemental damage. What defends well against small chunks of elemental damage? Armor does, if armor is capable of doing so. So this one's interesting in that this does not look like a buff to armor, but it actually is. Just a very indirect buff. Now, whether this is enough, because armor definitely needed a lot of buffs, whether this is enough to fix it or not, I don't know, but it is something to keep in mind when we come to those later points in one of the later videos. Unidentified corrupted Waystones can now be used to access a corrupted nexus. I did not realize that was not the case previously because I have not had a build that was able to do unidentified Waystones. Waystones can no longer have greater than 8 modifiers when corrupted. RIP. This was something I thought was intentional. It was possible to get up to 10 modifiers on Waystones because one of the outcomes, I believe, was to double exalt for prefixes and double exalt for suffixes, but to do so while ignoring the limits on the number of prefixes and suffixes that could be present on a rare item. That does not seem to have been intended, and as a result, it looks like that's going away. In fact, a lot of these other changes to map modifiers may actually be a severe nerf to the process of what you get when you Vaal Orb a map. We'll have to find that one out. Vaal Orbs on maps need to be retested after this. Items found in very high level areas that can have quality on them, they can now have up to 30% quality on them. Quality currency still cannot allow quality to exceed 20% on an item. This is part of a series of changes that are all based upon something that's been started in Path of Exile 1. Path of Exile 1, Granny Gear Games realised that players just consider items that drop on the ground to not be loot at all, unless they're a consumable item, or they've got some extraordinary, difficult to replicate permanent modification to them. Now there's a number of different things that can be done for that in Path of Exile 1, won't need to go into the details, but essentially, if it's not one of the top 0.001% of bases that drop on the ground, then chances are you're not interested in it at all. Ultimately, the stars need to align for something that's ground loot to be loot. In Path of Exile 2, a larger percentage of things that drop on the ground are potentially exciting drops. That doesn't mean they ID well. You can certainly apply an ID scroll to an unidentified tier 5 rare item that's a perfect base and end up getting a completely incohesive pile of garbage, but it doesn't happen as often, and you're at least excited at the time that you apply the ID scroll to it. And that's kind of like in Path of Exile 1. You can apply an ID scroll to a Watcher's Eye, and you can get complete rubbish there too as well. Now, what these changes are going to do, at their best, and I don't know whether it's going to be the best case or the worst case, at the best, you're going to be mapping, and you're just going to have an electrifying drop you weren't expecting. You can get one of the best chest armors in the game, and it's going to have 3 sockets on it. Or you're going to get a physical weapon, and it's going to have 30% quality on it. Either way, you're pretty much electrified by the drop. That's at its best. At its worst, it's going to turn a bunch of mundane items that you were still picking up, but they weren't really exciting. They were just sort of the bread and butter of your mapping. You're like, oh, okay, I'll take those imbued wands because someone that's doing a serious crafting project might apply essences to a full quad tab of them, and that person might pay quite a bunch, many divines, for a quad tab full of them. So you pick them up and you save towards getting a quad tab of them that you can then sell to one of these power crafters. And now you find out they're not interested in them because nowadays they're only interested in ones that have got the extra permanent socket on them because they can't replicate that with their crafting. I don't know which of these is going to win out for most players, whether it's going to be that occasional lottery drop or whether it's going to be that degradation of the bread and butter drops. But ultimately, this is concentrating some of the wealth that you get from just generic mapping out of the hands of the small items that drop and into those stars aligned lucky drops. These are your stars aligned lucky drops here, over qualityed items, just like in Path of Exile 1, and items that have 1 additional socket, and potentially can get 1 more additional socket with a lucky Vaal Orb. And from the extremely consequential and controversial to the extremely inconsequential and uncontroversial, the Abyss map is being renamed. This is being done because of the situation that's coming up with the new Abyss League, and the fact that everyone who's talking about Abysses is not going to be talking about a map anymore. They're going to instead be talking about the new content. For that reason, Abyss Map is being renamed to Marrow. Next we have some changes to the Atlas passive tree. These are pretty small because big ones happened in 0.20, and they were really needed ones. 0.20 did improve the Atlas passive tree quite a bit. So firstly, we have one that is related to Expedition. The Detailed Records Expedition Notable Passive Skill now provides +1 to the level of Expedition logbooks found in your maps, and Expedition logbooks found in your maps always have 4 implicit modifiers, previously 3. However, this is coming at the expense of no longer providing 30% increased quantity of logbooks that are dropped by runic monsters in your maps. I feel like this is a bit of a wash, maybe a little bit worse than it was, maybe a little bit better. It's going to probably be about a wash overall. The He Approaches Ritual Notable Passive Skill now provides revived monsters from ritual altars in your maps have a 40% increased chance to upgrade to magic or rare instead of 20%. However, it no longer causes ritual favors in your maps to have a 30% increased chance to contain an Audience with the King. What's the purpose of this? Well, they're changing the way Audience of the King spawns. It's no longer going to just be a single thing that appears in roughly 1 in 30 rituals. Instead, you're going to pick up splinters for it. So it doesn't make any sense the way that it used to be. It's going to be changed a little bit there. Essences are the next section. These have got a substantial rework, and ultimately, essences are just a fundamentally different mechanic to what they used to be. Forget everything you knew about essences in 0.1.0 when they were good, or in 0.2.0 when they did exactly what they did in 0.1.0, but they weren't very good because they got power crept by fracturing orbs. Instead, essences are going to do new things now. They're going to be much better early in the game, and they're going to fall off a little bit later in the game. And one of the things that they did here was that they identified that people, when they were trying to craft their own gear, they're often gated by not having enough Regal Orbs early in progression. And so they made it so that lower tier essences function as Regal Orbs as well. So instead of adding a modifier of a certain tag, essences now add a very specific set modifier. This is going to depend upon the tier of the essence and the type of item it's being applied to. And all except for perfect, they can upgrade a magic item to rare. When you do this, they will add a guaranteed modifier. So for instance, you can get fire damage to attacks. This is something you absolutely certainly know you're going to get, and you can put it on a weapon that already has a good start because it's already got 2 mods on it that you're like, hey, I'm already almost content using this. You know what I really want on it is a bit of fire damage to attacks. Well, you can then apply a lesser, normal, or greater essence, depending what level you are, to deterministically add that fire damage to attacks as your 3rd mod. And then, if you're still happy with the item, you can apply 1 Exalted Orb. If you're still happy, apply 2 more. That's going to be the way that you're going to craft a lot of early endgame gear, I think, in the Third Edict expansion. After that, we have the perfect essences and the essences that are obtained through corruption. These are going to remove a random modifier like an annulment orb, and then afterwards they're going to augment a rare item with a guaranteed additional modifier. Now it'll be interesting to see if the essences obtained only through corruption are as extraordinarily rare as they were in 0.20, or whether they're a bit more common than they were. In 0.20 they were very much a plaything of the rich and powerful, but who knows whether that will still be the case. And who knows whether perfect essences will also be extremely rare or not. Added 7 new types of essences. Essences of Torment have been renamed to Essences of Abrasion, and Essence of Hysteria now augments different guaranteed modifiers based upon the type of item it is applied to. And the final section we're going to talk about in the first video in this series is going to be what they term general improvements. This is mostly very small things, but there are a few cool things here. So unique strongboxes are just getting a couple of quality of life improvements. They'll have their own unique minimap icons. They won't look like an ordinary strongbox there. And additionally, the Rain Festal Beetle monster, this is going to have its own minimap icon when it's running away from you after you have tried to open it. There's a couple of very, very minor changes to the way that Asmerian Wisps work, and most importantly here, they're just going to appear a little bit later in the game. Skill and persistent buff gems now sell to vendors for gold based upon their level and quality. The idea here is that this is just a quality of life change. If you've got a whole bunch of gems you are definitely never, ever, ever going to care about, then you can just bulk vendor them if you want. The hooded one is no longer available in your hideout. You're going to have to use Doriani instead for mass identification of items, and that's going to be once you've completed the campaign. But you will still be able to identify items with the hooded one in town. Some boss arenas are getting minor changes, and then we have one of the biggest quality of life changes. Assuming I'm understanding this correctly, you're now able to log directly into town just by doing what you would normally do when you log in, or log directly into your hideout by holding control when selecting your character. This is going to be fantastic. And for control players, there are going to be different setups. You're going to want left trigger and A or X when you're using a controller to do this. This is going to save so much hassle. It's going to save a loading screen, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it really does tend to add up, especially on slower PCs. Another quality of life improvement, you can now use checkpoints to warp to the area's waypoint, as well as being able to use them with their existing functionality. Omens can now stack. The maximum stack size is 10. The Orb of Chance has received 3D art. Hey, not every single quality of life improvement can be a big one. Uncut, skill, support, and reservation gems can now be traded through the currency exchange. This one is fantastic. Party members can no longer attempt to interact with expedition portals, and NVIDIA Reflex has now been re-enabled. So, that is the end of part 1 of this video series. As it is, it's already really long. Having a look at where I am in terms of my DaVinci Resolve file is 50 minutes long, and then this recording that I'm doing as a final recording, this is 22 minutes long. So once I condense this one down, it's probably going to end up being something like 67 or 69 minutes long, this entire video. There has been a lot to go through, but we are still a very long way to go. My plan is that over the next couple of days, I want to break down everything here. This is going to be a big effort, and it means that I might be a little bit less active than usual down in the comments in terms of replying to people or all sorts of things like that. Hopefully, though, it ends up being worth it. I'm going to leave it there. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results.